Welcome back to our series on focus groups, and now we're in the third lecture where we're going to talk about limitations and cautions of focus group. I would be remiss if I did not take some time to explain to you why the focus group method is so flawed. And I say that as someone that conducts focus group research, okay? I want you to understand, I do not think focus groups are a very good method of research most of the time. They're way overused. They have a lot of pitfalls and a lot of dangers. And more often than not, they're requested because a client thinks that they are fashionable or interesting or sexy or anything like that, when the reality is that they are the improper form of research to use. So I'm just going to tell you right away, if you're going to use focus group research, you need to have very good reasons for using it. One of the best reasons for using it is because you have executives that want to observe. I think that's a great reason to use it. They will get more out of observing than they ever will from reading a research report that's been done really thoroughly. So if you're going to do focus groups for that reason with the observers in mind, go for it. Another reason that I think they're really useful is if you have a very short amount of time and you need to get some very quick insights because they're so efficient. With that said, there are a lot of pitfalls and cautions that you need to be aware of before you use them for any other application. So focus groups need to be conducted with a certain amount of rigor to produce valid, reliable data. And it's vitally important that you understand that focus group data should never be treated as projectable or quantitative. I don't care if you did 15 focus groups and they had 10 people each. You don't have a sample size of 150. Okay, what you have is you have 15 focus groups. Focus group data is not at all like data that you collect through survey research because it's influenced by a group. It's influenced in an artificial setting, and it just cannot be compared. It's apples and oranges. So even if you have all 150 of those people take a survey before the group, I would be very, very cautious about those findings just because of the context of how you got that data. As a general rule of thumb, for every subgroup you're studying, you should have at least 2 focus groups scheduled. So if I'm doing a focus group study here in St. Louis, and it's just with general people in St. Louis, 2 focus groups is enough. Because having 2 groups helps you to isolate the signal from the noise. If I hear the same thing in 2 different groups, I know that that is a real finding and that it's valuable. And if I hear one thing in one group and another thing in another group, that's noise. That's just created by the group environment. By individual opinions. It's not a real finding. However, let's say that I want to observe how people in North County, how people in South County, and how people in West County feel. Well, for that, 2 groups isn't going to cut it because I'm not going to have enough participation in those 2 groups to be able to isolate that. What I'm really going to need is 6 groups. I'm going to need 2 groups from North County, 2 groups from West County, 2 groups from South County, all being run, and then I can compare and contrast, first of all, what happened in those subgroups. So then the 2 groups from North County, I can find out what the signal data were there, and then I can compare that to the signal data in West County and the signal data in South County, and then I can draw more reliable conclusions. And I can talk about these are the differences and these are the similarities between these 3 regions. But again, a minimum of 2 groups per subgroup. So if you only do 1 group per subgroup, you are putting yourself in a lot of danger because what you're going to hear in that group, you're not going to know if it is something that is speaking more broadly about what the community feels or if it's just something that came out of that particular group. You have to be very careful about that. Some other problems to watch out for. Polarization is one of them. Polarization is where a group takes 2 sides, sometimes in unequal distributions. You might have like 3 or 4 people that feel one way and the rest of them feel the other way. And the group can then become argumentative. Kind of becomes like the political scene, where people pick their teams and then there's just no fruitful discussion that can happen at that point. When that happens, it's time to move on. Thank the participants for what they're doing and then move on to a new topic. Come back to that topic if you need to later. In a different way, maybe with a different approach, and try to discourage that polarization from reforming. But once people polarize, once they kind of go to 2 different camps and they have trouble meeting back in the middle, it can be really difficult to get control of your group back. So watch for it. As soon as you start to see it, move on and come back later if you have to. Groupthink is another really big problem in focus groups. Groupthink is where a group becomes single-minded, they start agreeing on everything, and the discussion tapers off in favor of general consensus. And the reason that groupthink can be so difficult is because the group seems to be going so well. Everybody's getting along, they're all working towards a common goal. You feel like everybody has really reached a point where they are giving great, reliable, useful data. It really feels like that performing phase that I talked about in the previous lecture. Well, here's the problem. Groupthink gives a real false sense of confidence because everybody seems to be agreeing, so you just assume, oh, well, this is not controversial at all. The reality is, when people are agreeing, you need to start challenging and shaking up the opinions just to make sure that that agreement is real. So start asking some participants to play devil's advocate or to project opposing views onto a fictional character. Say, well, if your neighbor were in the room, how would your neighbor feel about this? If your wife were in the room, how would your wife feel about this? If your kids were in the room, how would they feel about this? Have them start projecting. And that will help to break up the groupthink a little bit and get them to start thinking more like individuals, because they'll start relating to people outside the group and they'll start thinking about opportunities to express different opinions. Another problem is compliance or moderator bias. And that's where one or more participants is focused on agreeing with or flattering the moderator, often to curry perceived favor or to fall in line behind some kind of perceived authority. And this is where you have to be, again, really careful as a moderator that you're not establishing yourself as the authority figure. Some people just gravitate towards it anyway, and they feel a need to defer to you or give you special attention or kind of suck up to you. So you have to visibly engage and encourage other participants who are speaking out more candidly when you see this going on. You have to challenge compliant participants to express deeper views. And I don't want to say rebuff their advances, but you definitely need to kind of establish the norm that, no, this isn't what we're going to be doing, and I'm not interested in hearing this kind of information. I really want to hear you being candid and expressing yourself. So challenge them. Don't allow them to constantly keep telling you what you want to hear. The group leader problem is another issue to watch out for, where one or more participants takes on the role of a leader and other participants fall in line behind him or her. This can happen with personalities that you might not expect. One of my examples that I love to talk about is I was in Nashville, Illinois, and there was a hairdresser in the room. And though she herself was not a traditional leader, we usually think of it being like a strong male politician, maybe an older gentleman who has some military training, or who is the mayor or something like that. Well, this woman was a hairdresser. She knew everybody in town, and people were terrified of saying anything in the group while she was speaking, because she knew everybody and she gossiped about everybody. So when you have a group leader like that, and by the way, I've also had town mayors and things like that who have caused similar disruptions. When you have a group leader like that, limit the group leader's contributions and challenge him or her by eliciting contrary perspectives from others. So validate the other opinions and really try to keep the group leader from saying too much. The best thing you can do is kind of get them in a position where every now and then you defer to them and let them say something, but most of the time you're not letting them contribute a whole lot to the group. And the more you can encourage differences of opinion, the more you can break up that sort of power structure that forms behind them. Beware as well the contrarian, and group leaders who are upset at being sidelined can turn into the contrarian. But the contrarian is one or more participants who are determined to disagree with the rest of the group. Contrarians are difficult because sometimes it's just their personality. They just like to disagree with people. And sometimes in disagreeing with people, they can have valuable perspectives. So you do want to hear them. But at the same time, if they're always disagreeing with everybody, they're probably just doing it because they want attention. So try to have them articulate an opposite perspective and then have others evaluate it. So if they are talking negatively about something, say, Joseph, tell me a little bit about if you were going to say the opposite of that, how you would describe it. And then ask other people in the group, how do you feel about what he just said with the opposite of how he really feels? And let them kind of talk about the opposite of that. And that'll encourage him to think a little bit more productively about contributing to the group. It'll also give other people in the group something more than negative data to really focus on from that individual. Okay, literal mindedness is a difficult one. Sometimes you get folks in the group that just, for lack of a better way of saying this, are just not smart enough to be in a focus group. And I'm not saying that in a mean or condescending way, but they're just too literal. They cannot apply any kind of imagination. They don't understand metaphor. They have a difficult time evaluating concepts like advertising, messaging, or positioning, or things like that, because they just can't think in a way that is representative of how most of us think. And you have to be careful, because they will really monopolize your group, and they will really disrupt what it is you're trying to learn by being so literal minded. So if they're having trouble, first try rephrasing questions to be more direct and to the point, so that they know exactly what it is you want to learn, because they're not being literal minded to be obtuse. They just maybe don't have the ability to think the way you need them to think to participate in the group. Sometimes it's also useful to ask them what they think a metaphor or concept is meant to explain. There are often idioms that we take for granted, that we assume that other people know exactly what we mean, and because they don't have our culture or upbringing, they don't understand it. And that's all it is. It's not that they're too literal minded, it's just they don't understand the idiom that we're referring to. And this could be a real problem with advertising that was developed in another region of the country that's being deployed nationally, and you're testing it across a national market. There are just maybe people that don't understand the cultural cues that you're giving them. So sometimes literal mindedness is easy to mistake when what you're really seeing is people that just don't understand the cultural cues you're giving. Okay, remember, focus group participants only get 7 to 10 minutes each to speak in a 90-minute group. Unlike an in-depth interview where they might get 20 to 30 minutes, they only get 7 to 10 minutes each, and it's like 7 to 10 minutes they fight for. You know, they're in the midst of conversation when they're participating in those 7 to 10 minutes. And sometimes there are other people that will take those minutes away from them by, just wasting time. So help them make the most of the time that they have. Don't let them waste those 7 to 10 minutes. Let them really say things that are important and useful so that you can get the most out of your group. Now, one other limitation that I just want to really caution you on, more than anything, is the desire to rush to focus groups because they are what the client asked for, okay? I get requests for proposals all the time where clients want focus groups, and I start talking to them and realize really quickly that they want focus groups because they think that that's what research is. They think research is surveys, focus groups, and maybe in-depth interviews, and they don't really understand all of the other alternatives that are available to them. Don't rush to focus groups just because that's what they're asked for. Instead, take the time to work with the client to figure out what the research problem is and determine whether or not focus groups are the effective, useful method to get to the solution to what they want to know. And also, I would highly recommend, if you are going to conduct focus group research, pair it with other forms of qualitative or quantitative research. If you're going to do some focus groups, throw in some telephone in-depth interviews as well, just to have a check against what you hear in the focus groups. Do a quantitative survey, even if it's a small one with a convenient sample. Do something to get some outside perspective, because often what you hear in focus groups sounds really good and really reliable until you start comparing it to other data, and then you begin to question some of what you heard. And that's not to say that focus groups produce bad data or that they're not useful. They are very useful when they're used correctly. But using them correctly requires a lot of skill, it requires a lot of training, it requires a lot of ability to understand what it is you're trying to learn that only a group can give you. And this lecture series, while I hope has given you a good introduction into some of those topics, is not nearly sufficient for you to go out and set up shop as a focus group moderator. You really need to be trained in a much more rigorous and sophisticated way. So with all that said, we're going to end this lecture, we're going to go on to what we've learned, and hopefully you feel like you have a good handle on at least the big picture of focus group research.